Hello, and welcome to our discussion about unequal student attainment. There is a very strong relationship between a person's level of education and their socioeconomic status, as well as the amount of social mobility a person is likely to have and their level of education, which means you are more likely to stay in a middle class position or move to a higher social class dependent on your level of education. And conversely, if you come from a lower socioeconomic status and do not gain many educational credentials, you'll likely stay in that lower socioeconomic status as an adult. Now, this is not a certainty, it's not a guarantee, but because of the way our society is structured, it is very likely. The fact is, the amount of education a person obtains is a very strong indicator or predictor of social status, because education leads to economic opportunity. You will be considered for more jobs if you have more education, because more and more occupations require an education. So without those educational credentials, you would not even be considered for those jobs, as more and more require credentials to even apply for them. All communities, large or small, primitive or modern, demonstrate some kind of ranking with its members. There's always some kind of hierarchy, with some people in a higher, more desired position, and others in lower, less desired positions in the community. So you'll find leaders and people of higher prestige occupy positions at the top, others occupy intermediate positions, and then others are at the bottom of the scale. Now, those people who are in those higher positions in a community may be there for several reasons that don't necessarily involve education or money. Maybe they're highly regarded in society because of their work. So somebody who's a priest or a nun or a rabbi, so they are highly regarded because of that. Maybe they're highly regarded because of volunteer work or community service and thus are recognized for that. Maybe their prestige comes from nothing they themselves have done or accomplished, and instead what their family has done, and this reflects on them. There are some very clear examples of this that immediately come to mind for me, such as the Kennedy family in the United States, where one son became president and another became a senator and the attorney general for a period of time. Then both were assassinated. They had a younger brother, Ted Kennedy, who you see here, who was the state senator of Massachusetts, who never in a million years would have had the life he did if not for the Kennedy name, because frankly, a good part of his younger years, he was a really overprivileged, spoiled brat who was excused for doing irresponsible or stupid things because of the prestige of his family, as demonstrated by Chpt. In 1969, Ted Kennedy was married. In fact, his wife was at home pregnant, and he attended a barbecue in Chpt, which is in Massachusetts. And at the end of the night, he left with a woman named Mary Jo Chpt. He accidentally ran his car off the road where it overturned in the river. He swam to shore, and he admits he sat there for about 15 minutes. Then he walked back to the barbecue, passing several houses on the way, some of which had lights on, but he didn't stop to ask them to call for help or to help them. He went back to the crash site with a few friends, and they tried to get her out of the car but couldn't. They still didn't call for help. Instead, believe it or not, Kennedy jumped into the river and swam across it to reach his hotel on the other side for the night. He never did call that night. At 8 a.m. the next morning, a man and his son were fishing and found the car and reported it. Obviously, by that point, the young woman had died. But when an autopsy was performed, she did not drown. She suffocated, because there had been an air pocket at the top of the car when it flipped over. Her body was found in the back seat, her hands holding onto the top of the front seats, and her head tilted upward, like, to keep her head in that air pocket. And it's estimated that she lived for 2 hours after the accident because of that air pocket. Which means if Ted Kennedy had immediately sought help, in all probability, she would have lived. However, the only thing he was ever charged with was leaving the scene of an accident. And it's widely acknowledged that this was because the prestige of the Kennedy family carried him through this and through years of very public alcohol abuse during which he continued to be a senator. Now, of course, the main thing that comes to mind when thinking of how a society is structured and prestige is financial status, which we can easily get an idea of by looking at several factors. The neighborhood a person lives in, the car they drive, how often they purchase a new car, the vacations they take, if they do take them, how often they take them, the clothes they wear, all of that. All of these are very clear, yet indirect indicator of a person's or a family's economic and thus social position in their society. Whatever the case may be, even though people as a whole tend to downplay or deny the existence of these social and economic rankings, they do exist. Canadians in particular like to downplay the importance of social class compared to Americans. But the fact remains, in every community there is some kind of ranking system that seems to just naturally emerge when you have a group of people living in the same place. And what we're talking about here is socioeconomic status. The position of a person or family within a hierarchy based on a combination of education, occupation, and income. This is the term used by census bureaus to measure the economic condition of individual people, communities, and countries. Now, just as a side note, depending on where you live, other factors might be taken into account when determining somebody's general position in society. So, for example, in some countries, religion plays a much more prominent role in society and thus would come into play. In some countries, your ethnicity may directly affect your position in society or your gender. But in developed countries, socioeconomic status is determined specifically by one's occupation, income, and educational attainment. Why isn't there a much more detailed and complicated formula involved for determining somebody's position in society? Because all of the measures used are so highly correlated with each other. Your income is usually a result of your occupation, which is usually a result of your education. Your neighborhood is usually a result of your income, which is a result of your education, and so on. So all the factors are so closely intertwined that a more complicated formula just isn't necessary. And how do you measure general things like wealth or power? You know, these are also desirable things, but they're difficult to be measured. Socioeconomic status has shown repeatedly to be one of the strongest indicators of a child's educational outcomes, if not the strongest. We live in a democratic society, and social mobility remains one of the core values of a democratic society, because part of living in one means that anybody can improve their status with hard work, so that it doesn't matter what family you're from or what family you are or are not born into. With hard work and perseverance, you can be anything you want to be and go anywhere you want to in life. So we're taught that anybody can improve their social status or class with hard work. Canada is not as vocal regarding this idea as the US. You know, they have that idealized American dream, but the basic premise is still there. Now, in movies or on TV, we hear stories of people born into poverty who became successful all the time. And yes, dramatic upward mobility does occur, but it's actually extremely, extremely rare. This huge jump in status simply does not happen as often as Hollywood would have us think. You know, J.K. Rowling, who was a single mother who would go make use of the internet in coffee houses when she was writing Harry Potter. And Oprah, who would spend summers with her grandmother in a cabin with no running water, that kind of thing. The first president that had to take out student loans in order to attend university was Barack Obama, who was the biracial child of a single parent. All of these stories glorify how great it is that anybody can be anything with a lot of hard work. And as an extension of this is the general belief that anybody can go as far as they want to in the education system, as long as they are willing to put in hard work and effort. Everybody is born into their class of origin, and everybody as adults will occupy a class of destination. These can be the same, but they're not necessarily going to be the same. What we've tried to do as a society is ensure that for those who work hard, you're rewarded for that. So you could be born into a relatively poor family and as an adult live as part of the upper class. But this should also mean that you can be born into relatively economic comfort and find yourself as an adult living in a lower economic class. Now, because people naturally would prefer a higher status, the more attractive occupations, and we live in a highly stratified society, though, this leads to an allocation problem, which means the process of distributing people among the different positions in society. And this is a major function of the education system, which leads into what we've discussed before, social stratification. So, okay, we live in a stratified society. Everybody can't be at the top. What are we going to do? Well, to deal with the problem of allocation, societies, including ours, have developed strategies for regulating the process of status acquisition. So we've got strategies for determining who will go where on our socioeconomic status scale. Generally, this is based on two criteria: things you were born with that can't be controlled, and then things that you can control in your lifetime. So ascriptive criteria are things that you cannot control. You can't control the economic class that you're born into. You can't control the color of your skin. You are born one particular sexual orientation. You can't control those things. Those are ascriptive criteria. Achievement criteria are things that you can control with your own individual effort. So your personal skills or occupation or marital status or getting a driver's license or even your weight. So just to keep these straight in your head, what are achievement criteria? Things you can achieve. Now, most things in life, most life chances are determined by a combination of these. It's not just one thing. So for example, let's say somebody earns a PhD. Well, they earn it themselves. That's an achievement, and they do that as a result of a lot of effort on their part. But people from middle or upper status families are much more likely to pursue postgraduate degrees for a combination of reasons, including the economic status they're born into. Now, let's say that we lived in a society in which your status at birth, as well as your status as an adult, were to be determined based solely on ascriptive criteria, or that with which you were born. So whatever your status is at birth, that's going to determine what your status is as an adult. Okay, that means you're in a society where there's really no competition whatsoever for different positions. There's going to be no social mobility up or down. Whatever position you're born into, that's your position for the rest of your life, and it's the same for everybody else. And because of that, there is no competition. In other words, your class of destination is determined by your class of origin. That's not the kind of society we live in. We live in a society that is one of open competition, at least in theory. And this means that your future position is not determined by, or it's not a function of your status at birth. No, your class of destination will be determined by your own effort and ability. So that your position at birth is only a temporary status that doesn't restrict how much social mobility you're allowed to have. Instead of winding up where you started, you're going to wind up where you earn, which means it's a system of open competition. Social mobility is at least possible. Now, in their pure forms as presented, these two ways of allocating status just do not exist anymore. Absolutely 100%. These are extremes, but most societies do gravitate towards one or the others. So most societies can be characterized as either openly based on effort and ability, or closed largely determined by status at birth. So, for example, the caste system in India would be a good example of a society located closer to the closed end of the scale. That's actually no longer legal, but it's still deeply ingrained culturally speaking. Okay, well, then, how does this affect education? If you are in a society in which everything is determined by ascriptive criteria, things you cannot control, so your status at birth will determine your status as an adult, and no social mobility is possible, then that means the education system is going to be passive. There may be a fully structured, solidified, well-run education system in that society, but it's not going to have any effect on people's life, because your status at birth will determine your status as an adult. Very, very conflict theory. So, if people did go to school, they would be taught the skills and values appropriate to their class of origin. And for those that gained more education, who, for example, went to university, that would be geared to providing further confirmation of the status they already have. It would be aimed at cultivating upper class behavior and culture. Of course, the historical trend internationally is in the opposite direction. If you live in an open society, such as ours, where achievement is part of what determines your status as an adult, well, then the education system is going to play an active role. And this is when a school would function in part as a society's social selection agency. They would act as a screening device for people's claim to a future status. And that is what we have. So education's goal would be to provide everybody an equal chance to compete and to assess a student's class of destination based on their talent and ability and intellect and all of that. In other words, in an open society, the education system functions as a place where the passage of status from class of origin to class of destination is publicly negotiated. It's not predetermined. Now, in both an open and closed society, schools do act as a social selection agency, either selecting students on the basis of class of origin to keep them in that status, so they're not really selecting it, they're just confirming it, or selecting students on the basis of their ability and effort to go on further. And at least in theory, this is what our education system does. We reward students who demonstrate academic achievement. And this means that we live in a meritocracy or a meritocratic society. The idea of a meritocracy is a pretty optimistic one. And it's one that our society as a whole embraces. And it's something that every single one of you embraces, or you would not be attending university. Now, the big question is this an accurate belief, or are we all just fooling ourselves? If this is true, then there's going to be a whole lot of upward mobility for those who work hard. And conversely, those who do not will remain in lower status positions, or somebody will slide down the scale of social class into a lower position. Do all students have the same opportunities to succeed academically in accordance with their abilities and efforts, regardless of the socioeconomic status of their family of origin? Well, our education system says it helps young people from lower status families regarding their academics. But does it? Well, the extent to which society is meritocratic depends at least partly on how effective the education system is in this effort. On one hand, absolutely the education system clearly treats all students in the exact same manner in various ways, having the same expectations of everybody, clearly identified, and the desired outcomes clearly identified. We've got learning outcomes, rubrics, curriculum, all of that. So on one hand, everybody's treated exactly the same. So in other words, individual schools and the education system as a whole is a place where students are tested or assessed, that's then comparatively assessed, because we don't just assess students individually, we assess them in a comparative sense. And then we channel them in what the system determines is the right direction. Thus, students emerge from high school or trade school or college or university with a diploma or certificate or degree that qualifies them for entrance into a particular level of the social status hierarchy. So, through education, people can secure higher status jobs than their parents. They can climb to a higher status if they put in the effort and have the basic ability. So it can be concluded that education provides a channel not only to a better status, but also to social mobility in the broader sense. But we all know it's not quite that straightforward, don't we, from our own experiences? We know that some students do have more of a chance to succeed academically speaking, that some students start the education race way behind the starting line. And anybody who has ever worked in a school can see this. For example, those students who didn't attend a really good quality daycare or preschool, chosen based on its philosophy and curriculum and activities and adult-child ratio instead of its location or cost. Those who needed speech therapy but didn't have access to speech therapy because of a wait list and didn't have a private speech pathology instead because they couldn't afford it. Those who didn't attend soccer or hockey or swimming or art classes or what have you. So it has to be acknowledged that outlying factors have a direct effect on how a student is likely to perform academically speaking in school. This is why a student's status is so critically important, and this is why it's difficult, if not impossible, to claim that the education system is wholly equal, that it's a level playing field, because outside forces unlevel the playing field. The status of family of origin has been shown repeatedly to be one of the strongest indicators of a child's educational outcomes. Now, this is not an entirely pessimistic scenario, because over the last several decades, the educational attainment of children from all class backgrounds have risen steadily. And this is referred to as the Flynn effect, the fact that IQ scores have risen for everybody over the last several decades. Why did this occur? Because of various efforts in society to help disadvantaged children, including an increase in social services and an increase in the education system itself regarding different kinds of resources. But the disparity between classes regarding education have remained. That achievement gap has remained. Yes, disadvantaged youth are attaining greater levels of schooling, but advantaged youth have easily kept up with and increased their years of schooling as well. And because of that, there continues to exist an achievement gap between lower and higher income students. And this achievement gap exists at virtually all stages of schooling. For example, in preschool, those children who come from lower income homes are far more likely to experience delays in vocabulary development than our affluent children. In kindergarten, children from lower income homes tend to have lower language ability and lower levels of cognitive reasoning. And we know that in general, children from lower income homes lack school readiness or school preparedness.